Good morning, PV. So we're starting a thing today called Second Cup. Just a morning devotional time on Tuesdays and Thursdays that'll be done by me and other ministers and members of our church. And I wanted to start today with one of the reasons we are needing a second cup these days, which is, are you sleeping well? I've heard from a lot of friends over the past few weeks that this has been hard on their resting. And it made me think of a story in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is with his 12 disciples and they're fishermen and they want to get away from the crowds. So they go out in a boat out on the Sea of Galilee, and right in the middle of their little boat trip, crossing from one side to the other, there's this huge storm. And we know it was huge because in Matthew, when he tells it, he uses the word seismos, which is a word we still use today, like seismic. It's a word that's rarely used in the New Testament, and when it's used in other places, it's translated like earthquakes. It's a ground was shaking. So this is a typhoon kind of storm, which it would take to scare fishermen, and they were scared. And then they look over in the boat, and Jesus is, of all things, sleeping. So they go to wake him up, and they wake him up with a question that sounds very familiar to me these days. They say to him, "Don't you care if we drown?" Now that's not your question, but it's a version of your question. God, don't you care with this pandemic raging? Don't you care about my job? Don't you care about my ability to feed my family? Don't you care about my future and me getting into college or me staying in college? Don't you care about our wedding plans? Don't you care about our marriage? Don't you care? And it's interesting because Jesus doesn't actually immediately reply to their question. Instead, he gets up and he has a conversation with the storm, and the storm listens. He tells it to die down, and immediately it dies. And you would think that would be like this peaceful tranquility for all the disciples, but it doesn't. Instead, they go from being afraid of the storm to, Mark tells us, they're terrified of Jesus, because Jesus is bigger than the storm, and now they're trying to figure out, well, who does that mean he is? The actual original language, it says they feared a great fear, and I like that terminology a lot. They feared a great fear. There's this time in the book of Job, if you're familiar with Job, it starts off with Job losing all of his family and his wealth in a storm. And for 37 chapters, Job and his friends are kind of arguing about why God allowed this to happen. And finally, Job says, "Tell me why, God." And God shows up in the form of all things of a storm. The very thing that had taken Job's whole life from him. And God doesn't answer his question, which is interesting because God could have answered his question. God could have told Job, "Hey, Job, listen, I know this is really sad, but one day your story is going to inspire millions and millions of people who are suffering. Job, I know this doesn't make sense to you right now, but I have a lot bet on you, Job, and I'm trusting that you're going to be able to come out of this better on the other side." God could have told him that, but he doesn't. Instead, he just shows up in the form of the very thing that Job was afraid of. There's a guy named Viktor Frankl who says he was a Holocaust survivor in Auschwitz, and he was a psychologist, and at the end of it, he said, "I am convinced that people can get through anything if they realize there's something good that can come out of it, if they can have some kind of meaning out of it." So back to that story of the storm. Do you know who Mark was writing to? Mark was writing to Christians who were just starting to be persecuted by Rome, people who were going to die horrible deaths, people who were being beaten and arrested because of their faith in Jesus. And Mark is telling them this story to make sure they know Jesus is bigger than the storm. Mark would like us to know today, Jesus is bigger than the virus. Jesus is bigger, and we don't know what God is up to, but we know God is going to do something out of this. What would you say to those first Christians who got the Gospel of Mark? The ones who had their lives on the line for following Jesus? What would you say to them if you could go back and have a conversation with them? Maybe you'd see them huddled in their homes or their barns or wherever it was they were trying to hide out of the public eye. Would you go up to them and say, listen, I know this is scary. I know you don't know how things are going to turn out. But listen, one day, because of your faith, because of your sacrifice, because of the way you're living now, one day all these buildings around here, they won't have statues to Romulus or Jupiter. They won't be worshiping Aphrodite. One day, because of the way you're living now, there will be all over the world people who know this story about the Jewish carpenter that we believe is God. And as fantastic as that seems, because of what you're doing right now, God is going to take this and use it for His good and for His glory. I know it's hard. I know you don't know what comes next, but God is with you in this storm. And maybe that's what God wants us to know today too. Not that we know any idea of what the future holds. It's going to get worse before it gets better, all the experts say. But we believe God is bigger than this storm, and Jesus is in the boat with us. So, we're not afraid, at least not of the storm. We fear a great fear. We fear the right fear, because Jesus is bigger. Until next time, PV, grace and peace.